Imagine this: a lone woman on the scorching edge of the Llano Estacado in 1859, her hand scarred from pulling a dying Comanche chief from Quicksand, knowing full well that saving an enemy could cost her everything. Margaret Crowell had already buried her husband and only son in this merciless frontier. She lived isolated, trusted by no one, belonging to neither side. Yet in one split-second act of mercy, she bound her fate to a powerful Nokoni war leader. And 3 days later, his entire tribe arrived at her door. What price would she pay for that compassion? Would it bring protection or destruction? And could one grieving woman's choice actually stop a bloody war that seemed inevitable? This true frontier story ends in a way that has left millions in tears. Stay until the end. You won't believe what she did next. If you're moved already, hit subscribe, drop in the comments where you're watching from, and let's keep these forgotten stories alive. In the blistering summer of 1859, on the northern rim of the Llano Estacado, where the wind carried hot sand like invisible knives, Margaret Crowell lived alone in a small log cabin beside the Pease River. The land was raw and unforgiving, a place where the sky pressed down heavy and the horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by distant mesas that shimmered in the heat. 4 years earlier, her husband had died in a senseless clash between settlers and Comanche raiders, shot down in a dry wash over nothing more than stolen cattle. That same winter, her only son succumbed to dysentery, his small body wasting away, while she could do nothing but hold him as the fever took him. She had no family left to return to back east, and despair never quite drove her to end it herself. Instead, she chose the hardest path this frontier offered: sheer, stubborn survival. Every day blurred into the next under that relentless sun. Margaret set fish traps in the sluggish river, hunted rabbits with a weathered rifle, and patched her cabin roof whenever the wind tore through like a vengeful spirit. She kept that rifle loaded and hanging above the door, not for killing, but as a constant reminder that out here, life was held only by vigilance. The nearest settlement called her the woman who picks no side, a label that isolated her from wagon trains and fort gatherings alike. Whites eyed her with suspicion for living too close to Comanche territory. Rumors whispered that she traded with raiders, or worse. Yet that very neutrality kept her alive, allowing her to slip through the cracks of a land torn by constant bloodshed. One afternoon, the heat hung so thick it felt like breathing fire, and Margaret trudged along the riverbank to check her traps, her boots sinking into the parched mud. The air was dead still until a sudden, panicked whinny shattered the silence, a horse's cry of terror echoing from downstream. She froze, hand instinctively dropping to the knife at her belt, and crept forward through the cottonwoods. There, in a shallow bend, where the river looked deceptively calm, she spotted him. A grown Comanche man, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in dark buckskin, sinking fast into quicksand. The treacherous muck had him to the thighs already, pulling him deeper with every desperate shift, the water's surface hiding the deadly suction below. His painted pony had scrambled free to the far bank, reins trailing, leaving its rider alone against a slow, merciless death. Margaret's breath caught as she studied him from the shadows. This was no ordinary warrior, even half-buried. He held himself with iron calm, his movements measured, despite the panic in his eyes. Ornate bone tubes crossed his chest, eagle feathers adorned his braids, and a carved thunderbird pendant gleamed at his throat, marks of high status, perhaps a chief. Logic screamed at her to turn away. He was Comanche, enemy to every settler, part of the raids that had claimed her husband. No one would see. No one would blame her for letting nature claim its own. But memories flooded back unbidden. The cold weight of her son's body in her arms, her futile pleas for help that never came in that frozen cabin. Something snapped inside her, and before reason could win, she was moving. She grabbed her old mule's lid rope, yanked rotten fence posts from the ground, and lashed them together with frantic knots, tying the end to the mule's harness. The animal balked as she urged it forward, but the Quicksand fought back viciously, yanking the line and sending her sprawling, palms tearing open on sharp rocks, blood mixing with the mud. Gritting her teeth, she stripped the last scarf from around her neck, the one her boy had worn, faded and precious, and knotted it on to lengthen the rope. One wrong pull, and both she and the stranger would vanish into the mire. Muscles burning, she heaved again, the mule straining, until finally the man emerged, collapsing on the bank in a heap of mud and gasping breaths, alive but spent. He knelt there for a long moment, chest heaving, before lifting his head to meet her gaze. No anger flashed in those dark eyes, no overt gratitude, just a deep, piercing intensity, as if etching her face into memory. Without a word, he rose unsteadily, mounted his pony with surprising grace, and from a pouch at his belt drew a small carved bone thunderbird. He pressed it into her bloodied hand, his fingers lingering briefly. Margaret clutched it, her voice rough as she muttered, "This land's taken enough already." He nodded once, wheeled his horse, and vanished into the brush, leaving only hoofprints and the weight of that unspoken promise in her palm. 3 days dragged by in a haze of routine chores, the carved thunderbird bone tucked against Margaret's chest like a constant reminder of that riverside gamble. Yet she pushed the memory down, focusing on mending traps and scanning the horizons for threats. On the morning of the 3rd day, with fog still clinging to the Pease River, the earth began to rumble low and steady, a vibration that traveled up through her boots and set her heart pounding before her eyes confirmed what her instincts already knew. From the northern horizon, riders emerged, like a dark wave cresting the plains, more than 50 Comanche warriors advancing in tight formation, their ponies moving as one with the silent menace of a gathering storm. Dust rose in a choking cloud behind them, and the faint jingle of bridles and weapons carried on the wind, long before their painted faces became clear. At their center rode the man she had pulled from the Quicksand, now upright and commanding on his war pony, his buckskin clean, eagle feathers streaming, the thunderbird pendant catching the first rays of sun. Chief Nokoni himself, a name whispered in fear across the Llano Estacado for his unrelenting raids and iron leadership. They did not charge or loose arrows. Instead, they fanned out and encircled her small cabin in a living ring of muscle and menace, dismounting with practiced efficiency to set up camp on her very doorstep. Fires kindled and ponies staked as if claiming the ground for their own. Margaret stepped outside, rifle in hand, but not raised, her pulse thundering as 50 pairs of dark eyes fixed on her, weighing her worth in silence. The air thickened with tension, broken only by the snort of horses and the crackle of new flames. A young warrior broke ranks first, face twisted with raw grief and fury, his lance raised as he strode toward her, shouting in Comanche words laced with venom. Later, she learned he had lost his entire family to settler bullets the previous season. He lunged, tip gleaming, but Chief Nokoni's hand shot up in a sharp command, freezing the man mid-stride, the lance hovering inches from Margaret's chest before dropping harmlessly. The chief dismounted slowly, his presence alone quelling the murmurs, and approached her with measured steps, his gaze locking onto hers with that same piercing intensity from the riverbank. Through a warrior who spoke broken English, the chief's words came deliberate and heavy. The one who pulled me from the hungry earth no longer lives only for herself. Margaret stood firm, demanding an explanation, and the interpreter continued as Nokoni spoke, his voice carrying the weight of tribal law. Among the Comanche, saving a chief's life forged a debt deeper than blood itself, not mere gratitude, but a binding obligation that reshaped fates, demanding reciprocity that could claim lives or spare them. The story unfolded then. Near a sacred southern valley, a band of new settlers had encroached with land papers and rifles, spotting Nokoni scouting alone and shooting him without warning, the bullet grazing deep enough to fell him into the quicksand's grip. His warriors had tracked the attackers, rage building for full retribution. Cabins burned, scalps taken, no quarter given. But the chief's survival complicated everything. Margaret's act had preserved a leader the tribe needed, and now her word could prove the settlers fired first, potentially averting all-out war or dooming her as a liar if she refused. She was given the brutal choice: ride with them as witness to the truth, facing the men who might have ties to her own past losses, or stay behind and let the plains run red, her silence marking her as complicit in the eyes of the Nokoni. Margaret's refusal rose sharp and immediate. She owed no one more lives, her own grief still raw, the frontier having taken everything already. Yet, as the warriors waited, a small Comanche child clung to his mother's leg nearby, wide eyes mirroring her dead son's in that final fevered night. Fear and innocence cutting through her resolve like a knife. In that moment, something shifted inside her, the carved bone seeming to burn against her skin, and she nodded once, mounting her mule as the camp stirred to life around her. The debt was called, and she would answer it, riding into whatever storm waited ahead. The column moved out at dawn, Margaret astride her weathered mule in the midst of the Comanche riders, the carved thunderbird bone a constant weight against her chest as they struck south across the endless, sun-scorched plains. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the cracked earth, mirages dancing on the horizon, while dust coated everything in a fine red grit that worked its way into eyes, mouth, and lungs. No one spoke to her. The warriors rode in loose formation, their ponies sure-footed over the rolling dunes, eyes scanning constantly for signs of pursuit or ambush. Margaret kept her gaze forward, gripping the reins tightly, her mind churning with the recklessness of her decision, riding into potential enemy territory, with men who could turn on her in an instant if the chief's word faltered. Hours bled into one another under the merciless sky, breaks taken only in sparse shade beneath mesquite clumps, where water was passed in silence from leather pouches. The land itself seemed hostile, prickly pear and yucca clawing at legs, rattlesnakes coiled in warning as hooves disturbed them. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the child she had seen back at camp, his small hand clutching his mother's buckskin, and she wondered if this journey would spare him the horrors she had known or merely drag more innocence into the cycle. The warriors' faces remained stoic masks, but she caught glimpses of old scars and fresh grief in their eyes, reminders that every man here carried losses of his own from settler bullets and broken treaties. By the second day, the terrain shifted to broken ridges overlooking a broad valley, grass greener, where underground springs fed hidden seeps, a place the Comanche held sacred for winter camps. Smoke rose thin and steady from the settler encampment below, wagon circles, crude cabins taking shape, livestock grazing under armed watch. Chief Nokoni signaled a halt on the ridge, his warriors spreading out to observe while Margaret's stomach knotted tighter with each passing minute. She dismounted, legs stiff from the ride, and joined the chief at the vantage point, peering down at the cluster of white-topped wagons and figures moving like ants in the distance. As the group descended cautiously, staying to cover until the last moment, voices carried up on the wind, English voices, rough with frontier accents, barking orders, and laughter mixed with the cries of children. Margaret's blood ran cold when one voice cut through the rest, hoarse and commanding, directing men to reinforce a corral. She knew that timbre instantly, the same gravelly tone that had shouted warnings 4 years ago in that dry wash ambush. Her eyes locked on the speaker, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, sleeves rolled high, revealing a jagged scar across his left forearm from an old knife fight. The very man who had fired the shot that dropped her husband, leaving him bleeding out on the dirt while she watched from hiding. The recognition hit like a mule kick to the chest, memories surging unchecked. The crack of rifles, acrid powder smoke, her husband's body crumpling as he tried to shield their wagon. Rage and grief boiled up fresh, her hands trembling on the mule's reins, vision narrowing to that scarred arm gesturing below. She nearly wheeled her mount and fled, the urge to vanish into the plains overwhelming. Why face this ghost when silence had kept her alive so long? But the image of the Comanche child flashed again, superimposed over her own son's fevered face, and she forced herself forward, breath shallow, the thunderbird bone suddenly hot as a branding iron. Chief Nokoni glanced at her sharply, sensing the shift in her posture, but said nothing as they emerged into view of the camp. Sentries spotted them first, rifles snapping up, shouts rippling through the settlers like wildfire. Margaret rode at the chief's side now, heart hammering, stepping straight into the past she had buried, knowing one wrong word could ignite the powder keg around her. If real stories of raw frontier choices like Margaret's, standing between vengeance and mercy when everything screams to run, hit you hard, hit that subscribe button. We've got more forgotten tales that deserve to be heard, and your support keeps them coming. The settlers formed a defensive line, men with long rifles and hard eyes, women hurrying children behind wagons, the air thick with impending violence as two worlds collided once more on stolen ground. The confrontation unfolded in the harsh glare of midday sun, rifles glinting on both sides, while dust swirled from restless hooves, the valley holding its breath as Comanche warriors faced off against the settlers' ragged line. Chief Nokoni sat tall on his pony, his voice cutting through the tension in measured Comanche, demanding to know why his scouting had been met with bullets without warning, while the scarred settler leader barked back accusations of trespass and threats. Margaret stood exposed between them, the thunderbird bone clenched in her fist, her presence marking her as a traitor to one side and an obligation to the other, every eye boring into her as translator and witness. Shouts escalated quickly, English curses mixing with Comanche challenges, fingers hovering near triggers as old hatreds flared. Women clutched children behind wagons, faces pale under bonnets, while young settlers gripped weapons with white knuckles, eager for the fight. The air crackled with the promise of gunfire, powder smoke imagined in the dry wind. Margaret felt the weight of her choice crushing down. Speaking truth could brand her forever. Silence could unleash slaughter. She opened her mouth to intervene, but the scarred man pointed at her, spitting that she rode with savages now, proving every rumor true. His words rippled through the settlers, rifles swinging her way. Comanche warriors shifted, faces hardening at the insult. Margaret's pulse thundered, isolation complete as hatred radiated from both lines. Tension snapped tighter when a loose horse, spooked by the raised voices, bolted through the camp, hooves thundering as it scattered tools and clipped a young boy, sending him sprawling into the dirt with a sharp cry, leg twisting as blood seeped through his trousers. The child's wail pierced the standoff, mothers screaming while father surged, rifles aiming at Comanche as provocation. Warriors responded instantly, bows drawn and lances leveled, ponies sidestepping in agitation. The scarred leader roared orders to fire, muzzles rising, clicks deafening. Chief Nokoni held his men back by a thread, eyes burning with fury. Margaret pushed forward, arms raised, shouting to hold fire, but her voice scattered uselessly on the wind. In that frozen instant, with triggers half pulled and the boys' cries fading to whimpers, everything seemed lost. The debt called, the journey endured, all leading to this powder keg exploding. Bullets would fly any second, bodies falling in dust, the valley claimed by graves, and Margaret stood helpless at the center, neutrality shattered, failure bitter on her tongue. The scarred man advanced a step, barrel aimed past her at the chief, snarling that no savage would dictate terms on land paid for, while warriors growled responses sharp as their lances. Time stretched taut, the air thickening with impending violence, Margaret rooted in place, knowing no plea could stop the carnage now hovering on the edge. Margaret shoved past the frozen warriors and settlers alike, her boots kicking up dust as she planted herself squarely between the lines, arms outstretched to halt the madness teetering on the brink. The scarred man's rifle barrel wavered inches from her back, his curse dying on his lips, while Chief Nokoni's lance tip hovered just as close from the other side, the valley trapped in a heartbeat of suspended slaughter. Her voice cracked out raw and hoarse from days of dust and silence, cutting through the whimpers and heavy breathing. I know the man who shot my husband 4 years back in that dry wash over nothing. And I know the ones who shot Chief Nokoni last week when he rode alone. Faces on both sides twisted in shock, rifles dipping slightly, as her words landed like thrown knives, the scarred leader's eyes narrowing in recognition and defiance. She pressed on, breath ragged, eyes sweeping from the bleeding boy on the ground to the scarred leader's snarling face, and then to Nokoni's unreadable stare, the sun beating down mercilessly on the standoff. Neither side's clean. Bullets fly first, questions never asked. Blood pays for blood until there's nothing left but graves and ghosts haunting these plains. Murmurs rippled through the settlers, unease spreading as wives clutched husbands' sleeves and glanced at their own children, while Comanche warriors shifted uneasily, lances lowering a fraction at their chief's subtle gesture. Margaret's hands shook, the Thunderbird bone digging into her palm like a brand, but she held her ground, voice gaining strength with each syllable. But the kids ain't guilty. That boy bleeding there didn't choose this fight. The ones hiding behind wagons, yours back in camp. They didn't pull triggers or break treaties. Silence fell heavy as prairie snow after a blizzard, thick enough to choke on, every finger easing off triggers, while eyes darted between her and the leaders. The wind, the only sound, rattling through the dry grass. The scarred man spat on the ground, calling her a turncoat loud enough for all to hear. But his voice cracked, lacking the fire it held moments before, drowned out by the boys' weakening cries and the distant lowing of unsettled cattle. Chief Nokoni remained motionless atop his pony, his gaze locked on Margaret with that piercing intensity, weighing her raw truth against the fresh wound from the settler's bullet and the ancient grievances of his people. Seconds stretched into an eternity that felt like hours under the relentless sun, the valley poised on a knife's edge, one twitch or shout away from unleashing hell. Warriors gripped weapons tighter, ponies snorting in agitation, while settlers exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of outnumbered odds sinking in. Margaret stood rooted, sweat stinging her eyes, knowing her words hung in the balance. Accepted or rejected, they could tip everything into peace or plunge it deeper into war. Then Chief Nokoni raised his hand in a sharp, unequivocal command, his warriors responding instantly by easing bows and lowering lances, ponies stepping back in disciplined unison, as the tension snapped like a cut rope. He spoke low and firm in Comanche, his voice carrying the full weight of leadership, and the interpreter translated without flourish. No vengeance would stain this ground today. No cabins burned or scalps taken. The sacred valley would remain empty, settlers to abandon their claims, Comanche to forego raids, left wild to break the endless cycle before more blood soaked its soil. The scarred leader erupted in protest, face purpling as he waved his rifle, insisting on their legal rights and hard-won stakes. But his own people faltered, mothers stepping forward with quiet but firm pleas that mirrored Margaret's stand, children's safety outweighing pride. In the days that followed, wagons rolled out under the watchful but restrained eyes of Comanche scouts, cabins left to sag and crumble in the wind, the valley reverting to grass and silence. Margaret rode north alone on her weary mule, palms scarred forever, her son's lost scarf a ghost in her memory, returning to the small cabin beside the peas, where solitude waited unchanged. Years wore on with the frontier's familiar harshness, dust storms and lean winters, yet passing Comanche bands always detoured to her riverbank, watering their ponies in respectful quiet, and leaving bundles of jerky or fine hides on her step. No speeches, just silent recognition of the debt paid in full. Whispers carried her name across distant campfires and settlements, not as savior or sellout, but simply as the woman who stood dead center when every instinct screamed to pick a side or run. In that brutal land, where justice arrived twisted and vengeance ruled, halting one cycle of killing, even once, etched the truest mark a solitary person could carve into the dust. Margaret Crowell's quiet stand on that dusty valley floor didn't change the world, but it broke one brutal cycle in a land soaked with blood. A lone woman choosing mercy over vengeance when every side demanded the opposite. What about you? Was her decision to step between those rifles brave, foolish, or the only sane choice left on a frontier gone mad? Would you have done the same or picked a side to survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments, where you're watching from, what hit you hardest, anything. I read every one. Thanks for staying until the end of this forgotten frontier tale. If it moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next time, we've got another raw, true story waiting that might just leave you speechless again. See you soon.